You hear a lot on the internet about sensor size and how full frame is always the way to go, and Micro Four Thirds users love their sensor size too. So I'm going to try and work out what the difference between different sensors are and why you would want to use a bigger sensor or a smaller sensor in a camera. Whilst I am a filmmaker, most of this applies to photography too. Well, sensor size affects crop factor, depth of field, and low light. These are all very important characteristics that determine how your image looks. And we're going to start with crop factor because crop factor actually, as a knock-on, affects depth of field too. Medium format is very rare in the filmmaking world. It happens sometimes, but generally full frame would be considered as 1 crop factor or no crop factor. If you want to think of the standard lens measurement focal millimeter range thing, don't know where I'm going with this, but you think of full frame. That doesn't mean that full frame is the most commonly used format in filmmaking. That's normally APS-C or Super 35, but we're gonna stick with full frame being no crop factor just to keep things simple. APS-C or Super 35, which is what you find in most budget to mid-range DSLRs, has a crop factor of 1.6. Micro Four Thirds, such as the GH5, the GH5S, that has a crop factor of 2. And then you have cameras like the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera. Actually, that's one of the only cameras I can think of that has a Super 16x sensor, which has a 2.88 crop factor. I suppose there's the Blackmagic Micro Cinema camera too, but they are quite similar. Other than that, not a large number of digital 16mm sensor size cameras out there. So, what does crop factor affect? Well, the bigger the crop factor, the tighter your frame is. It's like you've cropped in on your image, hence crop factor. A little demonstration of the effects of crop factor. Let's say that this frame was shot on a full frame camera. It wasn't, it was shot on my DSLR with a 1.6x crop factor, but let's say, for the sake of argument, this has a crop factor of 1, or no crop factor. If there were to be a 1.6x crop factor on this frame, then it would look like this. With a Micro Four Thirds 2x crop factor, the frame would look like this. And with a Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera 2.88 crop factor, the frame would look like this. As you can see, crop factor really has a drastic effect on how much stuff you can get in your frame. If you want to get a similar composition to a full frame camera with a Micro Four Thirds or Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera, then you'll have to use a wider lens or move the camera further back. And we're going to come on to that a bit later with depth of field. If you're going to be shooting landscapes or in a small confined space where you want to get a lot of stuff into your shot, then full frame is probably the way to go. If you're filming stuff that's far away, like wildlife or sports, a camera with a larger crop factor will actually give your lenses a bit more reach. Personally, I would rather be able to go wider than I would go more telephoto, but that's just down to my shooting style and the kind of things that I shoot. Now we come to the knock-on effect of crop factor, which is depth of field. Now, I'm sure you've heard people say that a larger sensor gives you more depth of field, which is basically true. It's not that a full frame sensor gives you an inherently shallower depth of field, but because it has less crop factor, you can have a wider frame, and because of that, you can have the camera closer to your subject than you can with a crop sensor. Now, the closer you get your camera to a subject, the more depth of field you can have in the background. And this is why, if you compare an A7S to a GH5, you can get the A7S a lot closer to your subject than the GH5. So the A7S effectively has more depth of field. All of that was a slightly long-winded and complicated way of saying that yes, bigger sensor will give you more depth of field. Another result of having a larger sensor is better low light. This is not necessarily true, but it is easier to have better low light with a bigger sensor. The reason behind this is that one of the contributing factors to good low light is a low pixel density. If you look at a camera and you see how many megapixels it has, whilst more megapixels might give you a more detailed image, it's probably hurting the low light of the camera too. If you have fewer megapixels on a sensor, then the pixels themselves can be bigger, and a bigger pixel is more sensitive to light. Well, I guess that's kind of true, but Anyway, with a larger sensor, you can have fewer, larger pixels, hence better low light. This is the key to the dominance of the A7S in low light filmmaking. So far, all of the points have been very much in favor of a full frame sensor. The advantages of a smaller sensor is you can sort of get a bit more detail due to rasterization and having the resolution of the sensor more confined together. It's one of those things that I kind of understand, but I can't really explain. But it is true, you do get a little bit more detail with a smaller sensor, at least dealing with 1080p. Another benefit of having a smaller sensor, which I am much better able to explain, is that if you have a smaller sensor, you can have a smaller camera. So for travel and lightweight being stealthy, a mirrorless micro four thirds camera can be very good for that. And then we introduce speed boosters, which blur the lines of sensor size and crop factor somewhat. A speed booster does a couple of things. It shrinks the imaging circle of a lens, effectively reducing the crop factor of a sensor. If you have a Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera and the Metabone speed booster, the 2.88 crop factor becomes more like 1.7, which is a big deal. The other result of getting more light onto the sensor is that the lens effectively becomes faster. So speed boosters do help you get more depth of field. You have a wider frame, so you can get the camera closer to the subject, and your lens is a bit faster, so more depth of field too. That is, of course, until they break slightly outside of their warranty and scratch the back of your lens. Not gonna go there in this video. I have done another video about my experiences with the Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera, where I cover my adventures with the Metabone speed booster. This point is not so much a criticism of the Metabones, because it's actually pretty good, but with other speed boosters there can be issues with getting electronic control of your aperture and focus. This is assuming you're not using a manual lens with a manual aperture and manual focus, in which case it doesn't really matter. So after all of that, do you need a larger sensor? Well, larger sensors are often more expensive, so if budget is the main factor, you may not have a choice. But generally, I think most people agree that being able to get more depth of field is rarely a bad thing. So I would suggest strongly considering at least an APS-C size sensor, or maybe a full frame. If you do get a Micro Four Thirds or a Blackmagic Pocket Cinema camera, then it's definitely worth looking at a focal reducer, assuming that it doesn't break like mine did. If you found this video helpful, then please consider leaving a like and subscribing so as not to miss any new videos. See you later.